It's inescapable. We are push products everywhere we turn, and it's never been easier to get the things you need or want. The rise of Amazon and online shopping means everything is just a click away. The demand for goods is so high right now that ports are grappling with the surge of cargo, limited space for shipping containers, congestion on the seas, shipping delays, and a shortage on the shelves. But have you ever stopped to think of where your clothes, furniture, electronics, and other household goods, even your food, come from? And who's actually making them? Cheaply made, mass-produced products have implications to the environment and to the people making the goods. And nowhere is this seen more than in the fast fashion industry.
Fast fashion has turned us into these passive consumers who are constantly chasing the fantasy that buying more clothes will make us happy.
But the allure of buying inexpensive clothes comes at a cost. 8% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the fashion industry. Each year, 37 kilograms of textile waste per person ends up in Canadian landfills. Then there's the human rights atrocities.
This industry can be a real source of opportunity, or it can be a source of oppression. It can be a source of exploitation and abuse.
Sweatshop workers can make as little as 12 to 18 cents an hour, with long days and few rights. And there's an estimated 170 million child laborers around the world. From clothing to common household items and even food, the process that gives us cheap products is putting people and even kids at risk. This week on Context, how can we become smart, ethical shoppers in a consumerist world? Welcome to Context. I'm Maggie John. Do you know where your food, clothes, common household items come from? In a report that was released early this year, World Vision, known for their child sponsorship program, brought to attention the scary reality that Canadians could be contributing to the exploitation of children every time we go to the grocery store. More than $3.7 billion of food and goods that may have been produced by child labor was imported into Canada in 2019 alone. Sherry Way is the Engagement and Youth Officer at World Vision Canada and joins me now. Thanks for joining us, Sherry.
Thank you so much for having me.
So why is ethical shopping an issue World Vision is bringing attention to?
At World Vision Canada, we are committed to protecting children's welfare, especially those in poverty situation. And so in the global south, one of the biggest cause that hinders children's development to live a life that is full, according to what God has made us to, is the issue of child labor. So even though this issue might seem very far away somewhere across the world, us Canadians actually play a part and have an impact in this situation. So in the past years, almost a decade now, World Vision Canada have been advocating for legislation to change, as well as promoting consumerism that is ethical and sustainable.
The report Risky Canadian Grocery states that approximately 71% of all child labor takes place in the agriculture sector. Explain this for us. Why is this?
So children have very small hands that actually are really good at agricultural labor, such as picking cons, picking fruits, picking vegetables. They also are often involved in spraying pesticide that is highly toxic to their health and their well-being and development. And so that's why food a lot of time is one of the biggest what we called risky goods that are a lot of time would be involving child and forced labor.
And 8 million children were pushed into child labor as a result of COVID-19, an estimated threat to reverse 20 years of progress. Explain to me, what have you been seeing evolve and change throughout this pandemic?
So during the pandemic in the past 2 years, as Canadian families have been keeping their children at home, the opposite is actually happening across the world, especially in families in the global south, where they need to send children to work to help with the income at home. And so because of the pandemic, child labor has been on the rise for 20 years, and we're seeing now child labor has increased to 160 million of children worldwide. And when we talk about that, we're not just saying, children who helps out in the family farm after school. We're talking about 3D jobs, which are dirty, degrading, and dangerous, while children work in hazardous environment that harms their physical and mental well-being, development, and work that is dangerous.
And they're obviously doing this to provide resources for their family. What are some common household items we buy here in Canada that is being produced through child labor, be it food or clothing?
It really ranges from a wide spectrum. One of the biggest item is food. So whether that's tomato from Mexico or chocolate that's made from cacao or coca in West Africa, all the way to the clothes that we wear, such as cotton pig in India, to electronics with minerals from the DRC, or the makeup that we wear, the shine that is on our face. A lot of time, it's farmed. It's made from this chemical or this mineral called mica, and a quarter of mica are actually farmed illegally in India.
Okay, we have a minute left, but I want to ask these two questions before we take our break and come back with you. First of all, what are the big grocery chains saying about this, as well as what are you hearing from the Canadian government on this issue?
Large corporations, groceries chains, they do a really good job in publishing their policy, but in reality, there's really little that we see about their supply chain transparency in terms of where their goods are coming from. What are the multiple steps in the supply chain? Who are the people involved, the farmers, the worker? And so there's really, really little information that is accessible for consumers to know what they're purchasing. As in terms of the Canadian government, in the past years, we've been advocating for a modern slavery act, or what we call the supply chain transparency legislation, that demands companies to annually report publicly their efforts in addressing child labor in the supply chain. And the legislation or the act has been going through very multiple parliamentary studies, and committees after committees have been recommending the report. But the Canadian government, unfortunately, have been really dragging its heels. And so we're really pushing for the time to act, which is now.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, Sherry will share with us what the common Canadian can do to shop ethically.
In our fast-paced world, context is everything to the stories that are shaping us. We want to go beyond the headlines in our new podcast to create space for meaningful conversations, to explore where faith intersects with justice, ethics, culture, and society. We'll be joined by newsmakers, peacemakers, and culture shapers. Join us on all podcast platforms or at contextbeyondtheheadlines.com.
We're back with Sherry Way, World Vision Canada Engagement and Youth Officer. We all have purchasing power that can help child labor. Explain what that purchasing power is, Sherry.
For sure. When we think about the issue of child labor, it's a very big, complex global problem. And to address it really requires a complete paradigm shift from the farmer, worker, consumer, business, and government. And so the challenge of ethical consumerism is a lot of time we wish to pick up fair trade coffee and then right away the problem is solved, when in reality change is slow and requires collective commitment and persistence. And so for the everyday Canadian, the first step really is awareness, understanding our dollar have power. I love the quote by Anna Lepay: every time you spend money, you're casting a vote on the kind of world you want. And so when consumers start to shop ethical options, large corporations and brands like grocery stores start to noticing customer demand, and that helps them to shift the sourcing and production selection that appeals to consumer demand, which then lessens the import of risky goods. So every time when we purchase little by little, it actually helps shift our supply chain systems. And so Canadian can take actions right now, especially with holiday season, and what we see in terms of revenge shopping. This is our chance to buy ethically and sustainably.
And this is not just a reality in the food production world, but also in the garment industry and fast fashion. Explain to me what the effects are there as well.
What we're seeing in the past decades is the rise of fast fashion, where the fashion industry is driven by trends that comes off 52 weeks in a year. And we're seeing with globalization, labors are being cheaper. It's really easy to now exploit children because of their mental vulnerability, again, because of their small hands being so good in doing detailed knit work. And so fashion is actually one of the main causes and drivers of unethical and forced labor. And so what we have on our very well resourced guides is the ethical and sustainable fashion guide. For example, today I'm wearing the cotton turtleneck, and that is made from ethically sourced vegan cotton that has no pesticide, which means that farmers are not harmed in the process. They're also paid a fair living wage. And so even just choosing ethical fashion brands can make a huge difference.
Now, Sherry, something that I've been a little confused with, and hopefully you can clarify, because I'm assuming my friends watching at home feel the same way. If we stop buying these items, doesn't that just stop these kids or people that are working in this field from being able to make a living? It feels like it just, if we stop one thing, it's such a big issue that if we stop one part, there's so many other parts as well.
Yes, exactly. And so this is why we need to adopt this systemic lens and see it in a broad perspective. And so we're not saying, pull kids away from working, let families suffer in hunger and poverty. We're saying start investing in fair trade options, ethical companies, certification programs that actually ensure good ethical practices and labor practices, so that when family, like adult workers, are paid a living and empowering wage, they can then send their children to school. And when children are educated and they can be involved in safe work after school, no problem. But when children are raised up with education, they're able to then go into strong livelihoods and income. And so that actually breaks the cycle of poverty. So we're not just saying a one solution, but actually it's a holistic systemic change that we're pushing for when it comes to shopping ethically and fair trade.
So much great information. Thank you again, Sherry Way, World Vision Canada Engagement and Youth Officer. Thank you again for your time today.
No problem. Thank you so much.
Coming up, the Q panel weighs in. Ethical shopping, is it a privilege or something that should be accessible to everyone? What is our role in making sure that the cost of fashion and food isn't deadly? We'll discuss.
When we long for a nicer house, newer car, or dream vacation, it's easy to think that money buys happiness. God is all right with people having earthly possessions, but He's not all right when earthly possessions have us. If chasing happiness has left you weary, call our 24/7 prayer lines at 1-866-273-4444 or visit crossroads.ca/247prayer. Anytime, anywhere, we're here for you.
How do companies institute the changes that they need to make to ensure that their workers are being treated fairly? And what role do we have as consumers in all of this?
It's a report on the fashion industry. Baptist World Australia gives major brands a grade based on 5 different criteria. While 82% of Australians said they wanted to shop more ethically, they have no idea where to begin. And they're not alone. This is a global problem. The Ethical Shopping Guide is meant to help shoppers easily know which brands are paying attention to human rights and the environment in the production and manufacturing of their clothes. Peter Keegan, the Director of Advocacy at Baptist World Aid, explains how they came up with the ranking system.
Does the company have key policies in place? Do they have a code of conduct that means that their suppliers are required to respect the rights of their workers? Do they have senior management in the company who are taking responsibility for this and paying attention to what goes on, not focused just on the profit bottom line, but also focused on what happens to the workers in their supply chain? Does this brand know where its products are ultimately coming from? So most companies will have a really good idea about the final suppliers. They're the ones that sew together the piece of clothing that we may be wearing. But then if you ask, where does the fabric come from? And where does the raw material that's gone into that come from? Many companies, particularly when we started doing this research, just had no idea. They hadn't traced their supply chain back. And if you don't know where your products are coming from, then you can't do anything to ensure that the rights of workers and the rights of the community and environment are being respected in those early stages of the supply chain. Do they set up the contracts that they have with their suppliers in ways that are fair, in ways that have realistic delivery times, that are paying the supplier a fair price so that supplier is then able to pay their workers a fair price? It looks at, do they have the systems in place to be able to monitor what's happening? So it's all well and good to know where your product comes from and to have good policies, but are you following up to ensure that they're being followed and to make sure that workers are not being underpaid, that there's not unsafe overtime going on, that issues like forced labour are not still existing within your supply chain? And more importantly, if you do find them, which at times is going to happen, do you have a strong process in place to be able to turn that situation around and to provide remediation for the people who've been exploited there? Every worker in your supply chain being paid a living wage. So that's not just the bare minimum legal wage in the country, but a living wage that will enable them to be able to live a healthy and dignified life and provide for their families. Are there opportunities, are there mechanisms in place if something goes wrong for workers to be able to express a grievance or a concern and that's heard back by the company and they can then take action on that? The fashion industry, on some estimates, constitutes up to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Huge problems around water use and the use of chemicals, around land use change as different fibres are grown. So there's a huge environmental footprint that the fashion industry has. And this section really gets at are companies being intentional about the way that they design their products, about the fibres that they use, about the way they use water and chemicals, to ensure that their environmental footprint is minimised and in fact in places can turn positive.
And to make these changes won't cost as much as you might think.
To make the sorts of changes in supply chains that are going to really see workers and environment and the rights of the environment come to the fore is not that expensive. Actually, when you pick up a t-shirt or a dress or a pair of jeans, the portion of the cost that's actually going back to that worker is fractional. We're talking cents in the dollar here. So the cost difference required to pay fairly to ensure an ethical supply chain is not that great. The big change that's required is just putting this front and center for the companies in their business models. So as they see consumers more interested, more willing to make a commitment to seek out the information and to pick a more ethical option, that all provides pressure for these brands to shift what they're doing and to move in more ethical directions.
So the Q panel is here, and today we are discussing ethical shopping. Okay, friends, I'm going to put you on the spot a little. Show of hands, how many of us actually think about where our clothing comes from before we buy it? Yeah? Okay, Jackie, I can't really see your head. Oh, okay, so I'll go down. Okay, that's good. I will be honest, I don't always think about where my clothes come from. I look at them and I think, oh, that looks nice. I'd like to buy it. So this show has really been challenging me on thinking a little bit deeper about where my clothes come from, where my food comes from. So how about what you eat? Do you eat locally from ethical growers and manufacturers? And also the question is this a privilege? Jackie, I'll start with you.
Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking as you even asked the question. So, in terms of myself, I have made the decision more recently to move towards supporting local and organic when possible. But it is absolutely a privilege to be able to do so, whether it's with your food or whether it's with your clothing or anything else that you consume. Often, these products that are labeled fair trade or more ethical and that are marketed as socially conscious are a lot more expensive. And so, because of that, it isn't accessible to many individuals. And oftentimes, the actions done by certain individuals who are not of a higher tax bracket, like thrifting, for example, is sometimes looked down upon, even though that is something excellent that everyone can tap into in order to really be more socially conscious. So I think as we have this conversation and talk about the responsibilities that people have, and I think there are tremendous responsibilities that corporations have more than people, we also need to be conscious of privilege and how that plays into all of this as well.
Yeah, thrifting has actually become more of a cooler thing over the years, though. There are websites that are starting to submerge, that are rise, I should say, where thrifting is kind of a cool thing now. Brian, how do we change that? How do we change that conversation of privilege when it comes to saying, yeah, we should think about where our food is coming from. We should think about where our clothing is coming from, when maybe you're at a tax bracket where you're just happy to have $5 and be able to buy a meal.
Yeah, I think we actually need to pay real hard attention to that. We need to pay attention to the fact that if something becomes trendy, it becomes a marketer's friend, and it may not actually achieve what you want. So, classic example is the buy local. First of all, we can't buy local coffee beans because we can't grow them here. So there's that question. If we want to give up coffee, we could do that, but some of us will get headaches. I think the real question is you have to look deeply into these things because it's quite complicated. We are a global economy, and that is a good thing. It's a way in which we can serve one another. So I'll give you a classic example. We often like to buy local lamb, for instance, but if you actually do the economics and you look at it and you actually analyze how much, say, greenhouse gas is produced, it's actually better for the world to buy lamb from New Zealand, where they can grow it more efficiently than they can grow it in Canada. So these aren't easy decisions. We have to think about what is the best for the world? In what way do we actually interact with our neighbors in different places? And in what ways are we trying to achieve, I think, a sort of wholesome, perhaps even global understanding of justice in the economy?
Yeah, and the fact that you did research on lamb to figure that out, I mean, that's where all of us need to be, right? Where we care so much about what we're consuming that we do the research ahead of time. Moira, as Christians, do we care enough about the ethics behind the things we consume?
I think some people care. I don't think enough people care. And I think we need a lot of education and practice and encouragement, to really look at the sources behind what we eat, where we buy our clothes from. All that educational material must help, because I think so many of us just take what we have for granted. And I believe it's true that a lot more people are beginning to think in slightly different terms. You mentioned thrifting. I think the buy local approach is really good. It certainly works over the summer in particular. It's privilege sometimes, but it's also locality. Learning to eat food that grows around us instead of always wanting more, I think that's really problematic. So as Christians, I think, again, we could probably lead the way in pointing out some of the injustices behind the sources, behind the supply. I don't think we think about that so much as we think about, if I eat organic, it's probably better for me. So much of it seems to be, again, for me. And we definitely need a more global approach before we can actually change things.
Yeah, that leads so well into my next question, Jackie. 42% of the 25,000 consumers surveyed said the pandemic made them realize they need to focus on others more than themselves. Do you think that will last? And just to give a little more context to this is, we're talking about consumerism. This was a survey that was done of just, how people are shopping, their mindset now throughout the pandemic on how they're using their dollar wisely. And these people were saying, yeah, I'm starting to think about others. I'm starting to think about how my dollar has an effect on other people around the world. Do you think that will stick?
I do think so. We have seen so many shifts during the pandemic in people's attitudes about work and life and consumerism. Certainly, we've seen the impact that has happened to small businesses, and we understand what that actually means. And so I think this is all very hopeful, but I am cautiously optimistic because at the end of the day, corporations' goal is to sell to us. We are being marketed to all the time, even by these so-called ethical companies. There's an expression, there's no ethical consumption under consumerism. And I do believe that this is true. Ultimately, that responsibility needs to go to companies, and we need to advocate and make sure there are stringent policies and consequences in place for companies that are not adhering to laws, like the many Canadian companies, like mining companies, for example, that commit atrocities and human rights abuses abroad. It's sickening, and we're not as concerned about it as we really should be.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We have to put ownership on the businesses as well as ourselves. Brian, you were one of those people that put up your hand, said that you think ethically when you shop. So is the solution buying less or not buying at all? What is the solution to this issue?
Well, I mean, let's be honest. There's nothing wrong with consumption. We need to consume to survive, right? You consume your daily bread and you need to buy it somewhere. So it's very clear, both in Bible and tradition, that consuming per se is not the problem. I think wealth, though, is a tremendous temptation to actually forget about others, to forget about God and your neighbor, and actually focus on yourself. And I think it's incumbent upon us to actually build practices and rhythms where we actually intentionally take time away on a regular basis from consuming. Different church traditions do that. I know that our Catholic friends will fast on Fridays, often on Wednesdays. I think that Christians as a whole could get into the rhythm and habit of actually giving some of those things up on a regular basis. A friend of mine who lives in Ottawa has a little sticker on her fridge that says, we should live simply so that others can simply live. And I actually think that's core to the Christian conception of wealth and our consumption, that it should not be for ourselves, that it should be for others, and that our daily practices and rhythms should actually be sacrificing that for the sake of others. It will actually change your attitude, it will change your body, it will change your perspective. And I think that can only mean good things for the globe as a whole.
Yeah. Where else are you going to get conversation like this? But right here on Context, right? We're putting ethical shopping and our religion, our faith, what we believe into action together in such a great conversation. Thank you again, Jackie, Moira, and Brian. Today's topic definitely has me thinking. I will be the first to admit that I hardly ever pay attention to where my clothes come from or where my food comes from, much less who is being hired to produce common household goods I buy. But I have been challenged to use the purchasing power I've been given to make wiser choices for the sake of our environment and for the sake of the safety of those whose lives are at risk every day for our convenience. The cost of fashion and food can be deadly. Thank you for watching. Let us know what you think of today's topic. Join the conversation on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. For all of us here, I'm Maggie John. See you next time.
Thank you for your ongoing support of Crossroads, a supporter-funded nonprofit organization and member of the Canadian Centre for Christian Charities. Thanks to faithful people like you, we are able to continue producing Context. You can write to Crossroads, P.O. Box 5100, Burlington, Ontario, L7R 4M2, or visit crossroads.ca to learn more about our programs.
Context Beyond the Headlines invites you to an exciting new season. This year, we're expanding our reach with a brand new podcast that will explore the interaction between faith, justice, culture, ethics, and society. As we move forward with this brand new season and the launch of this brand new podcast, would you consider partnering with Context financially? It is because of the generosity of viewers like you that we're able to continue to tell the stories that matter.